President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday ordered Russia's first mobilization since World War II and backed a plan to annex swathes of Ukraine, warning the West he was not bluffing when he said he'd be ready to use nuclear weapons to defend Russia. In the biggest escalation of the Ukraine war since Moscow's February 24th invasion, Putin explicitly raised the specter of a nuclear conflict, approved a plan to annex a chunk of Ukraine the size of Hungary, and called up 300,000 reservists. If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will, without doubt, use all available means to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff, Putin said in a televised address to the nation. Welcome to Savvy Economists. Today we would be discussing the Russia-Ukraine war, and so far, people have thought Russia is losing the war, or rather would lose the war, but Jordan Peterson in an interview earlier this week said that he doesn't think Russia has anything to lose. As we dive into the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
But I do know that naive notions that the Russians are going to lose somehow, or that we're going to win, I just don't understand. I don't understand that. Well, what do you mean we're going to win? What are we going to win here exactly?
Well, I guess a victory would be that the Russians retreated from Ukraine.
With Ukraine in ruins.
Right.
Well, okay, fine. That's a hell of a victory. Like, I think Putin could manage that because I think he could tell his people, and I think they might buy it. It's like, we accomplished our objective. We devastated Ukraine and we kept it out of the hands of the West. And that's not great. It's not what we had hoped for, but it's better than the alternative. And I think they would buy that. And I think when Putin went into Ukraine, I thought a bunch of things, which I made a YouTube video about that. People criticized like mad. I thought, okay, well, what's happening here? Oh, I see. His end game for failure is that Ukraine is left in a smoking ruin. Oh, that's a victory. So then he can lose with impunity.
Right.
So how can we win? We can't win against Vladimir Putin anyways, because you cannot win against someone you cannot say no to. Period. And we can't say no to Putin because we sold our soul for his oil and gas. And we did that to elevate our moral stature in relationship to saving the planet. And so here we are, facing a very dire winter, hoisted on the petard of our own foolishness and moral presumption. We're saving the planet. We'll see. I don't think so. It doesn't look like it to me. And this is the most catastrophic issue here. Assuming that we're facing an environmental crisis of planetary proportions, which is not something I buy, by the way, assuming we are, well, then I would imagine that you would put in place measures that would ameliorate that problem instead of exacerbating it. But all the measures you're putting in place are actually making the environmental problem worse. So how is that even vaguely acceptable? And I look at that and I think, oh, I see. It's just like George Orwell said about middle-class socialists 50 years ago. It's not that you love the planet, it's that you hate humanity. So, well, have at her, boys and girls, and we'll see what happens this winter, and it's very terrifying to me.
Citing NATO expansion towards Russia's borders, Putin said the West was plotting to destroy his country, engaging in nuclear blackmail by allegedly discussing the potential use of nuclear weapons against Moscow, and accused the United States, the European Union, and Britain of encouraging Ukraine to push military operations into Russia itself. In its aggressive anti-Russian policy, the West has crossed every line, Putin said. This is not a bluff. And those who try to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the weather vane can turn and point towards them, he added. The address, which followed a critical Russian battlefield defeat in northeastern Ukraine, fueled speculation about the course of the war, the 69-year-old Kremlin chief's future, and showed Putin was doubling down on what he calls his special military operation in Ukraine. In essence, Putin is betting that by increasing the risk of a confrontation between the US-led NATO military alliance and Russia, a step towards World War III, the West will blink over its support for Ukraine, something it has shown no sign of doing so far. Putin's war in Ukraine has killed tens of thousands, unleashed an inflationary wave through the global economy, and triggered the worst confrontation with the West since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when many feared nuclear war imminent. Putin signed a decree on partially mobilizing Russia's reserves, arguing that Russian soldiers were effectively facing the full force of the collective West, which has been supplying Kiev's forces with advanced weapons, training, and intelligence. Speaking shortly after Putin, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Russia would draft some 300,000 additional personnel out of some 25 million potential fighters at Moscow's disposal. The mobilization, the first since the Soviet Union battled Nazi Germany in World War II, begins immediately. Such a move is risky for Putin, who has so far tried to preserve a semblance of peace in the capital and other major cities where support for the war is lower than in the provinces. Ever since Putin was handed the nuclear briefcase by Boris Yeltsin on the last day of 1999, his overriding priority has been to restore at least some of the great power status that Moscow lost when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Putin has repeatedly railed against the United States for driving NATO's eastward expansion, especially its courting of ex-Soviet republics such as Ukraine and Georgia, which Russia regards as part of its sphere of influence, an idea both nations reject. Putin said that top government officials and several unnamed leading NATO countries had spoken of potentially using nuclear weapons against Russia. He also accused the West of risking nuclear catastrophe by allowing Ukraine to shell the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is under Russian control, something Kiev has denied. Putin gave his explicit support to referendums that will be held in the coming days in swathes of Ukraine controlled by Russian troops, the first step to the formal annexation of a chunk of Ukraine the size of Hungary. The self-styled Donetsk, DPR, and the Luhansk People's Republics, LPR, which Putin recognized as independent just before the invasion, and Russian-installed officials in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions have asked for votes. We will support the decision on their future, which will be made by the majority of residents in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, Putin said. We cannot, have no moral right to hand over people close to us to the executioners. We cannot but respond to their sincere desire to determine their fate. That paves the way for the formal annexation of about 15% of Ukrainian territory. The West and Ukraine have condemned the referendum plan as an illegal sham and vowed never to accept its results. French President Emmanuel Macron said the plans were a parody. Kiev has denied persecuting ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. But by formally annexing Ukrainian territories, Putin is giving himself the potential pretext to use nuclear weapons from Russia's arsenal, the largest in the world. Russia's nuclear doctrine allows the use of such weapons if weapons of mass destruction are used against it or if the Russian state faces an existential threat from conventional weapons. It is in our historical tradition, in the fate of our people, to stop those striving for world domination, who threaten the dismemberment and enslavement of our motherland, our fatherland, Putin said. We will do it now, and it will be so, said Putin. I believe in your support. Some argue that Putin's speech shows he is out of options and in a desperate situation. His conventional military is mangled, so he is drawing on the only tools he has left, mobilization of low-quality reservists and nuclear threats. We should take Putin's nuclear threats seriously. Putin could use nuclear weapons to turn the tide of the battle. If facing the real, imminent prospect of losing the war, he is likely to use nuclear weapons first before being defeated. Washington's and Kiev's goal is to win the war, not to avoid nuclear attack at all costs. U.S. President Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky should not back down to avoid a nuclear attack. They should double down to win the war while deterring nuclear use. Why hasn't Putin used nuclear weapons already? He has been deterred by fear of a U.S. and NATO response. The United States and NATO should play on those fears and reinforce their deterrent threats. The White House's statement today that Russian nuclear use would result in severe consequences was on point. Vladimir Putin's September 21st speech was a desperate bid to avert defeat in his failing war against Ukraine and to use nuclear threats to dissuade the United States and NATO from continuing to support Ukraine. After Ukrainian victories in the northeast of Ukraine and continued progress in the south, Putin realized he could not achieve his war aims with a peacetime army. This was inevitable after his original blunder at the start of the war, namely, underestimating Ukrainians' capacity and political will to fight. The use of high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, and other advanced Western weaponry by Ukrainian forces made clear that the writing was on the wall. If Russia continues on its current trajectory, Ukraine can win the war. Putin's speech is, in part, a response to growing pressure from hardliners and military bloggers who have been frantically urging a more serious approach to Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. But the speech confirms that Putin remains resistant to initiating a full mobilization since he fears this could spark anti-war opposition if young urbanites faced mandatory conscription. So far, Putin's approval ratings have held steady by keeping the special military operation from seriously impacting the general population. The partial mobilization Putin announced will not produce 300,000 additional troops overnight. It will take 6 months or more to recruit and train the troops. Even then, the quality of the additional forces is questionable in light of the poor performance and indiscipline of Russian forces to date. The Ukrainians may make additional gains in the near term, further compounding Putin's political problems. Putin hopes to get out of his political predicament through the other two key points in his speech: his support of sham referendums on annexing Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories in the coming days, and his threat to defend those territories with nuclear weapons. After the, inevitably positive, results of the referendums are announced, Moscow will claim these are now integral parts of the Russian Federation, even if Russia doesn't fully control them on the ground. Putin is in effect warning Ukraine and the West that they will be risking nuclear retaliation if they seek to regain control of what Moscow now considers Russian territory. In this regard, Putin broadened Russian nuclear doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks, moving from if there is a threat to the existence of the state to if there is a threat to Russia's territorial integrity. Putin hopes that this will persuade the United States and its allies to reconsider their military support for Ukraine to avoid World War III. In responding to the speech, the United States and its allies should refuse to yield to nuclear blackmail. The fake referendums will not change the fact that all the occupied territories, including Crimea, remain Ukrainian under international law, and that Ukraine has the right to take back all of its sovereign territories. Any compromise would, as U.S. President Joe Biden emphasized at the United Nations General Assembly, mean ratifying the changing of borders by force, setting a dangerous precedent for other revisionist powers. To bolster the U.S. and NATO deterrence against Russian nuclear use, Washington must tell Russia clearly that the United States will continue to support the Ukrainian effort to regain all of its illegally occupied territories, regardless of the results of any sham referendum. Any use of nuclear weapons to defend the occupied territories would change the nature of the war, and the U.S. and Allied response would be consequential, either a massive conventional attack or a response in kind, depending on the nature of the Russian provocation. Amidst all these, Jordan Peterson strongly believes that no matter the outcome of the war, Ukraine remains devastated and Russia would always come out victorious because they had nothing to lose anyways. What do you think about the new tide of the war? Do you think the West would crumble under the pressure of avoiding a full-blown war and the energy crisis? Or would Russia back down and retreat? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching.